A Nuzlocke is a set of self-imposed rules applied to a Pokemon game to make the game more challenging, with the main rules being you can only catch the first Pokemon you encounter per route, and if a Pokemon faints, it dies and you can't use it anymore. Now a hardcore Nuzlocke is the same as a Nuzlocke but with some extra rules applied in order to make it even more challenging. So here are the rest of the rules for a Nuzlocke, as well as the ones for a hardcore Nuzlocke. I started by picking Mudkip as my starter. I think Mudkip will be the most helpful out of the 3 starters for this run, especially in the early game. Then, after beating May in the first rival fight, I got my first few encounters. I caught a Wurmple on Route 101, a Poochyena on Route 103, a Seedot on Route 102, a Wingull on Route 104, and a Zigzagoon in Petalburg Woods. I also encountered an Incada on Route 116, but I accidentally one-shot it with Water Gun. But then, Wurmple evolved into Silcoon and then into Beautifly, and Seedot evolved into Nuzleaf. And now it's time for the first gym fight against Gym Leader Roxanne and her rock types. Roxanne leads with Geodude and I lead with Nuzleaf. I go for Razor Leaf, but Geodude survives because of its sturdy ability and Roxanne goes for Tackle, which does not much damage. Roxanne then uses a potion on the next turn, but another Razor Leaf takes out the Geodude. Roxanne sends out Nose Pass next and I go for a Razor Leaf, which does about half of its health. And Roxanne uses Rock Tomb, which does not much damage. And then another Razor Leaf takes out the Nose Pass, winning me the fight against Roxanne and the first gym badge. Then I take a boat to Dewford Town and catch a Zubat in Granite Cave. Then Mudkip evolves into Marshtomp and it's time for the second gym fight against Gym Leader Brawly and his fighting types. Brawly leads with Machop and I lead with Beautifly. And I quickly win by one-shotting both Machop and Makuhita with Gust, winning me the second gym badge from Brawly. Then I get the Old Rod and catch a Tentacle in Dewford Town and a Magikarp in Petalburg City. Also, in a fight against a trainer, I stupidly didn't switch out Poochyena against Machop, and Machop killed her with a low kick, which is sadly the first death of the run. But I caught an Electrike on Route 110, and then May challenged me to the second rival fight, and she leads with Slugma as I lead with Marshtomp. A Water Gun brings down Slugma to the red, and an Incinerate from Slugma does minimal damage before another Water Gun takes out the Slugma. Then May sends in Grovyle and I switch into Beautifly as Marshtomp tanks a pursuit on the way out. May uses Mega Drain and I use Gust, which does almost half of its health. Beautifly tanks a Fury Cutter and a Pursuit, going for Gusts in between to take down Grovyle. Finally she sends in Welma and I use Absorb with Beautifly before Welma does massive damage with Rollout. I switch into Nuzleaf, tank a Rollout and go for a Razor Leaf, which barely doesn't kill the Welma, which then almost kills Nuzleaf on the next turn with another Rollout. But then Nuzleaf survives and takes out the Welma with Razor Leaf to win the rival fight against May. Zigzagoon evolves into Lanoon, but fighting trainers in the third gym, Wingull dies to a Rollout from an Electrode. An unfortunate loss, but now it's time for the third gym against Gym Leader Watson and his electric types. Watson leads with Magnemite and I lead with Marshtomp. Magnemite lives a Mudshot because of Sturdy, but barely does any damage to me with Tackle, and then a second Mudshot kills the Magnemite. And Watson sends in Magneton. Magnet Bomb from Magneton also basically does no damage and I one-shot it with another Mudshot. Finally, he sends in Voltorb and just uses Charge as I one-shot it with Mudshot easily, winning me the fight against Watson and the third gym badge. Next I caught a Geodude on Route 111 by smashing rocks, and then almost immediately lost it to a Makuhita, killing it with an Arm Thrust. And I also lost Electrike to an Oddish after Acid and Poison damage. But next, Zubat evolved into Golbat and then into Crobat, and I caught a Numel on Route 112 as well as a Coughing in Fiery Path. I accidentally killed my encounter on Route 113, which was a Spinder, and then I caught a Swablu on Route 114. My Magikarp evolved into Gyarados, which is probably the best addition to the team, and then I fought the Team Magma admin Tabitha and a Grunt at Meteor Falls. I sadly lost Nuzleaf to a critical hit Sludge from the Grunt's Coughing. Then I sent out Crobat, who cleared up the fight, taking care of Mightyena and Numel, while Coughing self-destructed. Then it was time for the first fight against Team Magma's leader Maxi, who leads with Mightyena as I lead with Beautifly. I one-shot Mightyena with a Silver Wind, and then switch into Tentacle and go for a Water Gun, which does a decent bit of damage. But then Maxi uses Earth Power, which brings Tentacle down to 6 HP. So I switch into Gyarados, go for a Dragon Rage, which does most of Camerupt's health, tank a Lava Plume, and kill Camerupt with another Dragon Rage. Finally, Golbat comes out, but 2 Dragon Rages take it out, winning the fight against Maxi, the leader of Team Magma. Then I catch a Machop on Jagged Pass, and challenge gym leader Flannery and her fire types to the 4th gym fight. She leads with Slugma and I lead with Marshtomp. Then I use Wultagan to one-shot her entire team of Slugma, Numel and Torkoal. This means the win against Flannery and gets me the 4th gym badge. Then May immediately takes me to the 5th gym right after, so it's time to fight Norman and his normal types. Normal leads with Slacking and I lead with Gyarados. He uses Yawn and I use Twister, which hardly does any damage. Then I mean to go for a bite, but I accidentally press Leer, which lowers Slacking's defense. Luckily it's okay though, because Slacking has the ability Truant, which means it can only attack every other turn. I stay in for one turn, so that if I switch on the next turn, then Slacking won't attack, so Gyarados falls asleep and tanks a Retaliate. Then I switch into Marshtomp on the next turn and Norman uses Yawn, and I go for Mud Bomb, which does a decent bit of damage. I go for another Mud Bomb on the next turn, which brings Slacking down to the red, and then Marshtomp falls asleep. I do the same strategy, tanking a Retaliate with Marshtomp so that I can switch into Crobat. And then 1, 2, 3, and 4 wing attacks are enough to take out the Slacking, finally. Norman sends out Vigoroth next, and I then switch into Machoke and take way too much damage, so I switch again into Linoone. Linoone doesn't take that much damage, and after 3 headbutts, one of them making Vigoroth flinch, it goes down. Finally, Norman sends in Slacking and I use 3 headbutts. The first one makes it flinch, it can't attack after the second, but then after the third, Slacking uses Chip Away, which brings Linoone down to 3 HP. I switch into Marshtomp on Slacking's Truant turn, and on the next turn, Slacking brings Marshtomp down to only 4 HP, but Marshtomp manages to wake up and hits a Mud Bomb, bringing Slacking down into the red. Then I switch into Coughing, and Coughing avoids a Swagger from Slacking and then takes it down with a Sludge. This wins me the hardest fight yet against Norman and the 5th gym badge. But soon after, something terrible happened. For my encounter on Route 119, I find a Tropius, and while I was only focusing on the damage I was doing to it, trying to weaken it, I didn't focus on the damage it was doing to me, and I let Marshtomp get one shot by a 4-time super effective Razor Leaf from Tropius. I catch it anyway, but this is definitely the most devastating loss so far. But moving on, Numel evolves into Camerupt and I get to Forestry City ready for the 6th gym fight. But before that, I find Steven, who luckily gives me the item needed to Mega Evolve Swampert. Now it's time for the 6th gym fight against Winona and her flying types. She leads with Swellow and I lead with Camerupt. She uses Double Team and then my Rock Slide misses, but it hits on the next turn, getting the one shot. Then she sends in Pelipper and I switch into Tentacruel as she just uses Protect. I use Poison Jab for a bit of damage, and then Winona uses Aerial Ace, which doesn't do much damage. She then uses a Hyper Potion, but after a few more Poison Jabs, the Pelipper goes down. Then she sends out Altaria and I switch into Gyarados. Dragon Breath doesn't do much damage, but it does paralyze Gyarados. She uses Cotton Guard and I get fully paralyzed, but on the next turn I manage to get off an Ice Fang, doing a decent amount of damage. Another Dragon Breath brings Gyarados down into the red, but I manage to hit a crit Ice Fang, killing Altaria. She sends in Skarmory and I switch into Camerupt and go for a Lava Plume on the next turn, one-shotting Skarmory, which wins me the fight against Winona and the 6th gym badge. I catch a Gloom on Route 121 and a Shuppet at Mount Pyre. I evolve Gloom into Vileplume with a Leaf Stone, and now it's time for Tate and Liza and their Psychic types for the 7th gym badge. They fight with Solrock and Lunatone, and I send in Vileplume and Camerupt. Solrock sets up the sun with Sunny Day, and Lunatone uses Light Screen to raise their team's special defense. I use Earth Power with Camerupt on Lunatone, not realizing it has Levitate so it doesn't do anything. But I use Giga Drain with Vileplume on Solrock, which does over half of its health. Another Giga Drain on the next turn takes out the Solrock, and then Vileplume barely tanks a Psychic from Lunatone. Then I go for a Yawn with Camerupt, putting it to sleep the next turn. I switch Vileplume into Gyarados and Lunatone wakes up, but Psychic doesn't do much damage to Gyarados. I switch Camerupt into Machoke, use Crunch with Gyarados, bringing Lunatone down into the red, and after Tate and Liza use a Hyper Potion, a Crunch and a Wake Up Slap from Gyarados and Machoke takes down the Lunatone, winning me the fight and the 7th gym badge from Tate and Liza. I catch a Welmer on Route 125, but now it's time for the final fight against Maxi, which I had to bring a completely different team for since my whole team was at the level cap. So Maxi leads with Mightyena and I lead with Wailord. I use Surf, which does most of its health, and Mightyena uses Scary Face. I use Strength to finish off Mightyena and Maxi sends in Weezing next. Maxi immediately goes for Explosion to sacrifice his Weezing for tons of damage, but luckily Wailord survives. Next up is Crobat, and Walrein doesn't take too much damage on the switch in, but on the next turn Crobat does quite a lot of damage with Acrobatics. I also do quite a lot of damage to it with Ice Fang, and after tanking another acrobatics, I finish off Crobat with Ice Fang. Finally, Maxi sends in Camerupt and Mega Evolves it as I go for Rest on Walrein to heal it up, but Rock Slide does a lot of damage, so I have to switch out. This Mega Camerupt is quite a big threat, so I decide to give Maxi a taste of his own medicine and use Explosion to sacrifice my Weezing to hopefully take out the Camerupt. And sadly, it does not kill the Camerupt and Weezing goes down. Weezing's sacrifice wasn't for nothing though, because Explosion dealt a lot of damage, so I'm able to send in Altaria, and after an Earthquake, Maxi using Yawn and another Earthquake, I'm able to take down Camerupt, winning me the fight against Team Magma's leader, Maxi. Maxi doesn't care that I won, and he summons the legendary Pokemon Groudon anyway, who creates a massive meteor and starts making its way towards the land. The recording I had for the Groudon fight got corrupted, but basically what happened was I went into this cave where I found Groudon. I just threw my Master Ball at it. Now it's time for the 8th and final gym badge against Wallace and his water types. He leads with Love Disc and I lead with Vileplume. Love Disc confuses Vileplume with Sweet Kiss, but it breaks through the confusion and kills Love Disc with a Giga Drain. With Vileplume and Tentacle, I am also able to finally take out his Milotic after a long battle with it spamming Recover. Wallace then sends out Whiscash, and I then switch into Vileplume and tank an Earthquake before healing back up with 2 Moonlights on the next turn. Then I take out Whiscash with another Giga Drain, and Wallace sends in Celio, which I also take down with a Giga Drain, and finally he sends out Seaking, who also goes down to another Giga Drain, which wins me the fight against Wallace and the 8th and final gym badge. The only thing left now is the Pokemon League, but after making my way through Victory Road, I first have one final battle with Wally. He leads with Altaria and I lead with Gyarados. I use Ice Fang to one-shot his Altaria and then he sends in Magneton. I switch into Camerupt, and on the next turn, Camerupt tanks a Tri-Attack, and I use Earthquake, which does basically all of its health, but it survives because of Sturdy. On the next turn, it uses Screech, and I'm able to take it down with another Earthquake. He then sends in Roselia, and I switch Camerupt into Crobat, as Roselia uses Leech Life. I one-shot Roselia with Acrobatics, and Wally sends out Delcatty. I switch into Machoke on the next turn, and take out Delcatty with a Wake Up Slap. Finally, Wally sends in Gallade and I switch into Wailord, and then Wally Mega Evolves Gallade and hits Wailord with a Psycho Cut on the switch in, doing over half its health. I decide the best way out is to sadly sacrifice Wailord so that I can get a free switch into Gyarados. I use Crunch on Gallade, which does a ton of damage, and then Close Combat from Gallade hardly does anything to Gyarados. And then a Crunch on the next turn takes Gallade out, winning me the fight against Wally. And now it's time for the final challenge, the Pokemon League. Before I start though, I'm going to explain a really good strategy that I'm going to use with one of my Pokemon, which will hopefully help me massively with the Elite Four. And that Pokemon is Linoone. Linoone doesn't seem like the strongest Pokemon, but with the move Belly Drum to maximize Linoone's attack stat and substitute so that Linoone can survive long enough to use Belly Drum, as well as its high speed stat, Linoone can outspeed and one-shot a ton of Pokemon in the Elite Four with this strategy. Pair this strategy with Return and Shadow Claw for Ghost types, and I have a crazy powerful Pokemon ready for the Elite Four. If some Pokemon use certain moves in some fights, then this strategy will not work, but it will pay off massively if it does work. And now there's only one thing left to do, and that is to beat the Elite Four. First up is the first member of the Elite Four, Sydney and his Dark types. He leads with Mightyena, and I of course lead with Linoone. I set up a substitute, and Mightyena uses Swagger, which fails. I use Belly Drum to maximize Linoone's attack, and Mightyena uses Crunch, which breaks my substitute. But it's okay because Linoone now outspeeds Sydney's entire team. And with its attack stat maximized, Linoone one-shots Mightyena, Shiftry, Sharpedo, Absol, and Cacturn with Return. After winning the fight against the first Elite Four member Sydney, it's time for the second member, Phoebe and her Ghost types. She leads with Dusclops and I lead with Linoone again. Substitute would be pointless, since Dusclops only has Ghost type moves and can't hit normal types like Linoone anyway, so I go for Belly Drum. Dusclops goes for Confuse Ray, which lands and confuses Linoone, but I gave Linoone a Person Berry before the fight so it could heal the confusion if it got hit. And then using Shadow Claw, I also one-shot her entire team of Dusclops, Sableye, Banette, Dusknoir, and finally her other Banette, which wins me the second fight against Phoebe. I move on to the third fight against the third Elite Four member, Glacia and her Ice types. Glacia leads with Glalie and I obviously lead with Linoone again. And I decide to take a risk by going for Belly Drum first, since Glalie usually always uses Hail on the first turn, which it does. and Linoon can survive the hell with the extra health it gets from the citrus berry I gave it before the fight. Then I use Substitute and Glalie uses Crunch, which the Substitute tanks for Linoon. And then a Return takes out Glalie and a Shadow Claw takes out the first Frostlass. However, Shadow Claw is 90% accurate, and against the next Frostlass, it misses, meaning that Frostlass hits a Blizzard, which is okay because of the Substitute, but if this happens again, Linoon will probably die. I go for a Shadow Claw on the next turn, and luckily it hits, one-shotting Frostlass, and after this I one-shot Walrein and Glalie with Return, winning me the fight against Glacier. It is now time for the final Elite Four member, Drake and his Dragon types. I actually can't use the same strategy this time since most of his Pokemon outspeed Linoon. He leads with Altaria, so I lead with Gyarados. I use Ice Fang and get a crit which one-shots Altaria. Then Drake sends out Salamence, which gets the Intimidate attack drop on Gyarados. But on the next turn, a Crunch brings it down into the red, but a Thunder Fang also brings Gyarados into the red. Drake heals Salamence with a full restore, and predicting this, I go for another Ice Fang, bringing it into the red again. The exact same thing happens on the next turn, and then confident that Gyarados outspeeds, I go for another Ice Fang, and luckily it hits, taking out the Salamence. Then Drake sends in Flygon and I switch Gyarados out for Tentacruel and tank a Rock Slide. Then I one-shot both of his Flygons with Ice Beam. Finally Kingdra comes out, and an Ice Beam does a bit of damage to him, and a Dragon Pulse does a bit of damage to me. A Sludge Wave brings Kingdra down into the red, and after tanking another Dragon Pulse, a second Sludge Wave takes out the Kingdra, winning me the final Elite Four fight against Drake. And now only one thing stands in my way. Every fight, every death, and every win has led up to this moment. It's time for the final fight against the Pokemon League champion, Steven. He leads with Skarmory and I lead with Linoon. I go for Belly Drum as Skarmory sets up spikes to damage my Pokemon when I send them out. Next I use Return, which only does half of its health, and a Steel Wing brings Linoon down into the red. Then another Return takes out Skarmory, and then Steven sends out Aggron. I go for a Shadow Claw for a bit of damage before Linoon, the MVP of the Elite Four, falls to a Stone Edge. Thanks to Linoon, I get a free switch into Gyarados and I use Waterfall, which avenges Linoon and finishes off Aggron. Steven sends in Cradily and an Ice Fang does almost half of its health before it confuses Gyarados with Confuse Ray. I use Ice Fang, but Gyarados hits itself in confusion, and an Ancient Power from Cradily does loads of damage to Gyarados. And on the next turn, I break through the confusion, but Ice Fang misses and Cradily brings Gyarados down into the red with Ancient Power, meaning I have to switch out. I send in Vileplume, and after easily tanking an Ancient Power, I use Toxic, Protect, and Moonlight to Toxic Stall it before finishing it off with Giga Drain. Next is Claydol, and I Toxic Stall it using the same strategy to take it out. Steven then sends in Armaldo, and I decide that it's time for another sacrifice. So I use Toxic to poison Armaldo before it uses X-Scissor to kill Vileplume. This means I get a free switch into Tentacruel and I use Surf on the next turn to one-shot Armaldo. Steven then sends in his final Pokemon, Metagross. Metagross Mega Evolves and I misclick and use Sludge Wave, which doesn't affect Metagross, and Tentacruel gets one-shot by a Zen Headbutt. I send in Crobat and use U-Turn for some chip damage so that I can switch into Gyarados to sacrifice it since its health is already very low. I send Crobat back out and use Aerial Ace, but it hardly does anything and Crobat also gets one-shot by a Zen Headbutt. I watched as my whole team was killed. I now only have one Pokemon left, Camerupt. So, Metagross uses Giga Impact and I survive. Now I can use Earthquake. But Metagross survives on what looks like 1 HP. I couldn't be closer to winning, yet I'm about to lose this whole run to the final Pokemon on 1 HP. I've won the final fight against Pokemon champion Steven, and with that, I've won the entire run.